Welcome to our next panel discussion. As Josh said, what comes after the sandbox? Now, from Singapore to New York to countries in the Gulf, all around the world, regulatory sandboxes have been important testing grounds for fintech experimentation. And the challenge now is to move beyond pilot projects and to scale proven innovations from experimentation to operation. So how are companies faring in the sandbox? What regulations, what policies, and what support would help them thrive in the real world? This session will examine the successes, the limitations, and the lessons from sandboxes and explore how regulatory frameworks can evolve to support sustained fintech growth and real-world impact. And I'm delighted to be joined for this discussion by two experts. I have with me Mr. Parma Bains, a financial sector expert at the IMF, involved in the regulation and supervision of digital financial services. Welcome to the stage, Parma. And also with us have Mr. Geoff Stecyk, Managing Director for Bahrain at Rain Financial, a cryptocurrency exchange company. And Mr. Stecyk also has a lot of banking experience, formerly with Akli United Bank and also RAK Bank in the UAE. So they're perfectly positioned to talk to us about what comes after the sandbox. Please welcome my panelists. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I think we're nicely positioned here to have both the macro view that I think Parma can bring from his work with the IMF and the more micro local view from Geoff operating in our region. But let's start with a nice broad opening question, which is going to be, how are, in your view, companies faring in the sandbox? In your view, what works and what doesn't work? And I think, Parma, we'll start with you for that one.
I think if we're going to talk about what works and what doesn't work, because that's quite a broad question. If we're going to do 20 minutes of sandboxes, it's probably worth having a common understanding about what sandboxes are, because there's many different models, right? And we might have slightly different understandings of what those models are. So you've got your regulatory sandboxes, which is the most common type of sandbox. They've been around for a decade, where you're testing a product against existing regulation, right? It's a controlled environment to test innovative products and services with real consumers against existing regulation. That's a regulatory sandbox. Now, sometimes people say, well, there's no licenses or there's no rules. Well, there's different types of sandboxes. You have a policy sandbox. You're not here testing the product against existing regulation. You're actually testing regulation itself. So it's like an extension of a consultation regime. The UK is doing it with the Digital Security Sandbox. The EU is doing it with the EU pilot regime. Hong Kong are doing similar things. You have digital sandboxes where firms can connect to APIs. But if we're talking about regulatory sandboxes, it's important also, I think, to understand that models differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That's okay, because mandates are different, legislation's different. You've got different sort of needs, demands, constraints, and that all impacts what your regulatory sandbox ultimately is going to look like. And, you know, if we talk about what works and what doesn't work, I was lucky enough to be part of a team that launched the world's first regulatory sandbox. And if I think about what worked, we had reasonable expectations of what we wanted the output to be. We had clear strategic direction, and we put the resources in as well. Fundamentally, a sandbox exists because regulators are risk averse. We're kind of like goalkeepers in a football team. You can do 1,000 things right, you do one thing wrong, and the press are on you.
You're remembered for that.
Yeah. Exactly. And so if you have an innovative business model coming into the gateway, you're not able to assess it against existing regulation, or you're not able to sort of assess it or benchmark it to a firm that's in the market because it's innovative. The easy answer is to say no. A sandbox allows you to say maybe. Where it doesn't work is where you have an unrealistic expectation. So a government body says, we need innovation, let's throw a sandbox at it. It doesn't work like that.
Okay, thank you, Parma. That's nicely setting the scene for us and helping us with some of those definitions. Geoff, based on your experience at Rain, what have been your experiences of the sandbox environment, the most significant lessons you've learned from Gulf regulatory sandboxes?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So just taking from Parma's macro explanation, I'll start off by saying we're a bit biased on sandboxes. And I say that because it was foundational to our success. The fact that we started in a sandbox with our journey, started in the sandbox, went to licensing, went to launch, then went to funding, then went to regional expansion. And when you look at that journey, it really started with the sandbox. If I take a look at our journey and say there was many things that it was a tough journey, number one, but the 2 or 3 things that made it successful or that distilled down to key success variables, I think the first is kind of defining, like you said, what does success look like? And defining what you want to achieve out of the sandbox. And for us, that was existence. It wasn't we'll go in, we'll try things out. It was, we have to succeed here to move to the next level of existence. And when you're focusing on existence, you get focused very quickly on doing the right things. I think the second thing we looked at is making it a holistic undertaking. So it wasn't just a tech play, and we weren't just trying something out to keep a board happy. It was, let's develop the whole business, because when you move from the sandbox to a licensed entity, you have to be ready to operate. And the third major thing that I think helped us really become successful, or what worked out of that, was continuous engagement with the regulator. It wasn't come in and then only talk to the regulator once you're at approval stage. It was continuous engagement, and especially at that point, the reg was quite early, and we were one of the early entrants into the sandbox. But you have continuous engagement then, because then once you're licensed, you continue to have continuous engagement, and that's how the relationship builds really from the beginning.
Thank you, Geoff. People talk about the pilot trap, which I guess talks to the risk of being stuck in that space and actually never emerging, stuck in the chrysalis, never become the butterfly. How did you, at Rain, were you confident that you would move beyond the pilot, move beyond the sandbox, and to what extent did you have to be really conscious about making that step?
I think confident, I mean, at that, if you go back, this was pre-2020. Crypto was quite new in the region, that we didn't have the level of acceptance that we have today at 2025. So everything was pretty tough at that stage, is moving every part of the journey. So confidence, we were fixated. And I think fixation is probably a bit better word. Fixated on doing whatever it took to get into the licensing and become a fully operational business.
Because it was existential.
Existential. And that's very different, Rob, from when, I mean, you see some of the larger legacy institutions want to try out an idea and they say, okay, let's just throw it in the sandbox and that will look good for the board paper. That's very different than when you're, for lack of a better word, fighting for your life and making sure that you get to the next stage to continue existing and to have an offering to the market.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there's probably another element I completely agree with yours from the sort of the micro side. I think there's an element from the macro side as well. And that's where, if a regulator sets up a testing framework in a way that's not conducive to learning something new for the firm or the regulator, well, then you're obviously going to fall into this pilot trap. So if you're exempting licenses, or if you're saying, all right, you don't need to be subject to this rule or that rule or this rule or that rule, well, when you graduate into a full prudential or conduct regime. And that for me is problematic, because at that point, what is it that the regulators learned, and what is it that the firm has learned? And the truth is absolutely nothing, right? Because compared to the full prudential conduct regime, if you've been tested to a portion of that, well, of course, you're going to fall into a bit of a pilot trap.
Yeah. And I suppose, Parma, I'd ask you actually, whilst regulatory sandboxes have, to some extent, been celebrated as a launchpad for innovation, it's obviously not a guarantee. And do you have a perspective on what percentage of pilots can be expected to mature and evolve from the sandbox? What does it really take for fintechs to succeed beyond that sandbox? It's no guarantee, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, if we think broadly, there's probably about 200 to 300 fintech unicorns around the world, depending on the data source. How many of those do you think have tested in a regulatory sandbox? The answer is 0 or close to 0. How many, off the top of your head, high impact sandbox tests can you think of? There's outliers, there's certainly success, and we've got, on the stage here, those outliers. But actually, the large market impacts just haven't existed. And that goes back to the way that regulators set up these sandboxes, have reasonable expectations, have clear strategic vision. And success isn't only on the industry side. And again, there are successes, because we have seen in certain sandboxes, firms that test in the sandbox get access to a greater amount of funding than similar firms that don't test in the sandbox. But from a regulator side, we see small successes as well. Again, if I use the example of myself in the UK sandbox, one of the things that I did was authored the guidance on crypto assets back in the UK, and a colleague did one on blockchain. And we managed to write that paper because of a third of all firms that tested in the first cohort used blockchain as the underlying technology. So we learned some things that we could then put into practice.
Thank you. Geoff, you've talked about how actually sandbox status was quite a difficult thing for you to navigate at times, in terms of being taken seriously, in terms of getting interest and investment, and it wasn't really until you emerged with your license that then things were able to take off. It was, when you think back to that time, did sandbox status genuinely help, or was that a label that you struggled to escape for a period of time?
A great question, Rob. I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, actually. Because so when you're in the sandbox, number one, you're in the regulatory sandbox. So the ecosystem is starting to take you seriously. There's some legitimacy, but you're in the sandbox and you haven't quite graduated. So when it comes to things like funding, they're looking at you, but they also want to see you licensed and you're in the market and you have real clients. Opening bank accounts, you're still in the sandbox, you haven't been licensed. So what we found is, we had to go once again, this was very early in the curve. We had to go the extra mile, but quite frankly, if we weren't in the sandbox, it would have been 10 times harder.
Okay.
That's even securing those elements, which were a challenge back then. Without the sandbox overhang or sponsorship, it would have been very difficult.
And therefore, now thinking back about that time, if you had that time again, what would you do differently, or what would you hope would have been different about that sandbox environment?
I mean, hindsight's always 20/20. I think once again back then, the fixation on getting the business up and running was paramount to us. Looking at some of the ecosystem elements that had to fall into place, you probably would have front-loaded those a bit earlier and got working on those a bit earlier, because they take time. So going through the onboarding to get your client money account and your operational account, when you're working on building the tech, you may not realize that could take up to 6 months in some circumstances, especially back then. So just figuring out which ones could have the longest lead time and then front-loading that to the proper extent.
Fantastic, thank you. Parma, obviously Geoff's experience of that sandbox environment is 5-6 years old now. And I wonder, with your sort of oversight and view of how regulatory sandboxes have changed over that half decade, what's different now? And is there more evolution for the sandbox model ahead? What should Sandbox 2.0 look like, given the learnings of the past 10 years or so?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And sort of, being along the journey for those 10 years, about 18 months ago, we did a piece of work at the IMF that reviewed almost 100 different sandboxes around the world. And we found that the vast majority of them weren't serving the purpose that was intended for them. In fact, a significant proportion of them had been running for more than 5 years, but hadn't had more than a handful of firms test, and fewer than that graduate. So I think the first question is there a need and a necessity? The second question is, if there is a need and necessity, what needs to change to deliver the outcomes that you want? Now, some regulators have powers that perhaps others don't. Singapore's a very good example here. They're allowed to and able to invest in some of the firms that test in their sandboxes. And of course, that's great for the firm. different regulators might have different views on whether that's good or bad. I certainly don't have those sort of a view one way or the other. But actually, there's a couple of models that are beginning to excite me and sort of I'm quite passionate about. One is a policy sandbox, which I alluded to, right? Part of the consultation regime. Usually you build a regulation and then 18 months later you do a post-implementation review. And at that point, whether it works or not, regulators are hesitant to go back and revisit that. And so now if you can test that regulation while it's being developed, I think that could lead to quicker regulation and regulation that's more suited to the market, that is proportionate to the risks that are in the market. And I think that's good for startups especially. The second is digital sandboxes. So the ability for certain business models to access real, aggregated, anonymized, or synthetic data. And I think that's really good for smaller startups that need access to data to build machine learning algorithms, for example. And you can scale a product from proof of concept to proof of value, hopefully relatively quickly. And again, that's a promising avenue that I think looking forward is quite exciting.
Great, thank you. Geoff, you were smiling at some of Parma's early comments there around the evolution of sandboxes and what works in certain jurisdictions. Your thoughts on Sandbox 2.0?
Yeah, so Rob, I think the context we would look at it is the sandbox is a start point, and it fits in usually with the evolution of regulation. But I think from our standpoint, we're looking at how does the whole ecosystem evolve. So you launch an ecosystem and you get to minimal support within the ecosystem. Then I think there's a role to develop that ecosystem and get more wholesale support across the ecosystem. And then in my mind, the third stage is building a competitive ecosystem, because these ecosystems are all, the neighboring ecosystems are all competing. And getting a competitive ecosystem and looking at how do things need to continue to evolve continuously in a hyper-competitive environment. I mean, cryptocurrency is hyper-competitive. And the ecosystems also need to compete because they're trying to attract talent and we're trying to attract customers. So getting that holistic perspective and looking at how do we continuously evolve becomes quite important.
Thank you. Parma, you had a comment to add there.
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that Geoff said. I think the one thing that I think is quite important. Competitive doesn't always mean lower regulatory standards. Competitive can mean proportionate regulation, clarity of regulation, and clarity of expectations of what you expect the firm to do during the testing framework and what the outcomes that you as a regulator are wanting from that test and what the firm wants from that test as well. So competitive, sometimes we synonymize that with lower regulatory standards, and I don't think that needs to be the case.
You name-checked Singapore. Obviously, we're here in the Gulf. What do you think are the opportunities for the Gulf countries to leverage their sandbox experience and position themselves as global leaders in fintech regulation and adoption?
I think there's a lot being done well, particularly here in Bahrain, because I have worked with the Central Bank of Bahrain for several years, and I know that their sandbox has been established 6 or 7 years, and Yasmin and her team have done an excellent job building something that I think balances the need to be open to innovation while ensuring that markets and consumers are protected. And I think that is a blueprint of what a successful sandbox should be. There are things around the Gulf that perhaps are pushing the envelope of ensuring that balance is in place. But ultimately, thus far, I think most regulators have found that balance in a way that works for them in their unique circumstances in their markets.
Thank you, Parma. A minute or so left. I'm going to give you the final word, Geoff. And thinking back to your experience of entering, working with and emerging from the sandbox, what advice would you give to the next generation of fintechs entering sandboxes today? If you were going through this all over again, what advice would you give?
It's a tough one because very different context and timing today. So I think the big one, you obviously need to have strategic clarity and know what success looks like on the other side. And I think you need to be very realistic about competing in an industry where there's lots of capital coming in, lots of competition, whether it's in Bahrain or UAE or the other neighboring countries, and looking at what will be your competitive advantage when you emerge as a licensed entity, and make sure you're just not another player on a very crowded stage. So strategic clarity is going to be key to success.
Great, sound advice. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your contributions today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think we'll get our photos taken on the stage, and then, ladies and gentlemen, it's into a networking break to enjoy the company of your fellow delegates. So thank you very much for listening.